already. When we try to develop evidence, we try to develop this evidence for informing the decision of physician at the end. And currently, we have 3 distinct production systems contributing to the overall evidence production for therapeutic interventions. We have primary research with a lot of people involved in randomized controlled trials. We have evidence synthesis with people performing systematic review and meta-analysis. And we have guidelines development. In fact, it's well known that randomized controlled trials are considered the gold standard by which new medicine, devices, health apps, or other interventions are evaluated. We know that the highest levels of medical evidence are usually sought to be large randomized controlled trials or meta-analysis of high-quality randomized controlled trials. And randomized controlled trials on meta-analysis are used as the basis for the development of treatment guidelines and to inform clinical practice. And the evidence produced is huge. More than 25,000 randomized controlled trials are published each year, and overall, we have more than 600,000 randomized controlled trials available in PubMed. And the number of systematic review and meta-analysis shows a near exponential growth. And we have tens of thousands of guidelines and hundreds of thousands of recommendations that have been developed over the last 30 years. However, the current system of production of evidence has been strongly criticized and challenged in recent years. In fact, clinical trials are very frequently poorly designed and conducted. We know that flaws in the design, conduct, and analysis are frequent. We have shown that 40% of trials included in Cochrane reviews are at high risk of bias. Almost half of the pivotal studies forming the basis of the European Medical Agency approval of new cancer drugs were judged to be at high risk of bias based on their design, conduct, or analysis. Outcomes assessed in randomized controlled trials are highly heterogeneous. For example, we know that in the field of schizophrenia, more than 2,000 different rating scales have been used over the last 20 years. But the good thing is that these waste could be partly avoided by simple and inexpensive methodological adjustment. And we have shown that in a paper with Yuri Yordanov. It's very well known that clinical trials are poorly reported. Half of completed randomized controlled trials are never published. Selective reporting of statistically significant clinical trials and outcomes are frequent. Important outcomes are frequently missing. As an example, in the field of non-opioid analgesic in adults after major surgery, only 26% of the trials reported serious adverse events. And such reporting bias lead to unrealistic and misleading estimates of drug effectiveness. We have nice examples, for example, in the field of psychiatry, demonstrating that there is an overestimation of the treatment effect by at least 30%. The generalizability of the evidence from randomized controlled trials is also challenged. We have very frequently missing or incorrect comparison. In fact, there is very few head-to-head comparisons. Research settings are not typical of community. Patients are highly selected, and the relevance of outcomes is low. A large number of trials use surrogate outcomes rather than patient-reported outcomes. Now the system for systematic review. There is also a failure of the current system of systematic review. The current process leads to a series of disparate systematic reviews in terms of selection criteria, search dates, methodological quality, and overlapping scope. And in fact, to address the global picture for a researcher or for a physician, making an overview of these multiple systematic reviews is inherently complicated or not doable. We have done an example about the second-line treatments of advanced non-small cell lung cancer drugs. There is 58 treatments available, 92 trials, on more than 30,000 patients involved in these trials. There is currently 29 systematic reviews, and you could see the network of drugs. And even when considered collectively, the series of existing systematic reviews does not provide a complete and up-to-date synthesis of evidence for a given condition. We have constructed in this field cumulative networks of randomized evidence, and evidence covered by all existing systematic review was consistently incomplete, with 40 to 60% of treatment missing, 45 to 70% of trial missing, and 30 to 58 of patients missing. Therefore, even if we consider all the systematic review in one specific field, you are unable to answer to the question of physician among all the different treatments, which one is the best. And in fact, my perspective is that the current systematic reviews do not address the needs of patients, physicians, and decision makers. A systematic review typically focuses on the comparison of two treatments, A versus B or A versus placebo, but the key question posed by patients, physicians, and decision makers is not this one, is among all existing interventions for a given disease, which of these interventions work best? And to this end, reviews should ideally incorporate all treatments available for the condition of interest and all clinical trials assessing these treatments. We have also doubts about meta-analysis of randomized controlled trials. And here is an example written in a report for the Académie Health in US in 2009. As much as we all loved randomized effectiveness trial, it is an unrealistic expectation that we will have randomized trial for every intervention and its combination in every patient subgroup. We need effectiveness in a timely manner. Randomized trials take time to conduct. Therefore, 85% of the comparative effectiveness research evidence is from non-experimental data. And now it's not so clear that we need to perform only systematic review and meta-analysis of randomized controlled trials, or to include also observational data. Individual patient data meta-analysis of randomized controlled trials, it's extremely clear that it would be useful to do that, but such meta-analyses are very rare, mainly because having access to all data is extremely difficult. On performing IPD meta-analysis in many fields is impossible to do. As an example, we have shown in orthopedic surgery that we identify 38 research questions, and we could have access only for one question to more than 50% of participants in trial in this domain. Overall, we were able to obtain data only for 15% of eligible patients. And in fact, there is a growing negativity toward meta-analysis. For years, people are discussing that meta-analysis are only as good or as bad as the studies they include, and if the data are poor, the product of the meta-analysis will be poor as well. But now, there is people that are discussing the community of people performing meta-analysis. 2 weeks ago, in The Lancet, Richard Horton wrote something about the gravy train of systematic reviews, and he said that, but what if the astonishing energy, commitment, and productivity of the systematic review community are poisoning rather than nourishing medical practice? And in fact, he throws a baby with the water of the bath. Guidelines are not based on high level of evidence, and there was several papers demonstrating that only a small percentage of recommendations are supported by evidence for multiple randomized controlled trials or a single large randomized controlled trial. As an example, among recommendations in major cardiovascular society guidelines, such as American Heart Association guidelines, only 8.5% among the more than 2,900 recommendations are supported by high level of evidence. In fact, in any current guideline, there are only a handful of very strong recommendations based on multiple consistent randomized controlled trials level of evidence. And the most disturbing part for me is that this pattern does not appear to have meaningfully improved over the last 30 years. There was two very nice papers, first from Tikochi and the second from Fanaroff, about the same guidelines from the American Heart Association, and there is no improvement since 1984. In fact, we have three production systems, trials, systematic reviews, and clinical guidelines that largely function in parallel or silos. These systems are actually highly interdependent. The quality of guidelines on meta-analysis is dependent of the quality of trials. However, such interdependency is limited to data, not organization. And we have to think how we could reinforce the link between trialists, systematic reviewers, and guideline developers. We have to try to implement a virtuous circle of continuous improvement in the quality of evidence rather than to have separate groups of people working. And I could add, in addition, a meta-researcher as me who criticize the other production. In fact, it's critical to identify new ways for collaboration between trialists, systematic reviewers, and guideline developers to create space for real changes to occur. And my proposal is to develop living community condition by condition rather than siloed activities. We have to bring together community, including clinicians, systematic reviewers, patients, trialists, methodologists, statisticians, and guideline developers, accepting to join their efforts to improve research and the production of evidence in a field. We have to leverage this community to improve beyond evidence synthesis the whole production of evidence, choice of the research question of interest, quality of the design, reporting of trials, data sharing, and so on. And in fact, my dream is to develop a culture of continuous improvement of clinical research for a specific disease, with, in the middle, a living network meta-analysis, for example, but also people working on living mapping of research to help the planning of future trials, living monitoring of trials conducting quality, living monitoring of trial transparency, living disclosing of the quality and transparency of results, and living guidelines at the end. If we want to think about the living mapping of evidence and gaps, such a community could help trialists to plan better trials and to improve the research agenda by providing an updated mapping of existing and ongoing research, by helping them to identify gaps, to direct future primary trial to the areas for which evidence is most needed, to provide information about the main methodological limitation of previous trials in the field, and to avoid doing again the same errors. We could also help trialists to anticipate future data sharing, for example, by providing them counseling about their trial consent forms. We could have also such a community that could organize a living monitoring of trials conducting quality. They could very easily assess if the outcomes used are the core outcome set that has been developed for the disease. What is the risk of bias of this trial? Is there some avoidable waste? What are the most frequent methodological errors in previous randomized controlled trials? They could also perform a living monitoring of trial transparency. What is the quality of the reporting? Do the people give access to their protocol? How many people accept to share their data? And this community could also organize the living disclosing of the quality and transparency of trials by funders, by cooperative groups, by journals, by universities, or whatever. Such community could also have a proactive and incentive approach to improve transparency. For example, they can identify very easily on clinicaltrial.gov or ADRACT all trials as soon as they are terminated and could send emails to remind PIs and sponsors the law requiring the posting of results. We have the same law in US and in EU. And it's mandatory before 1 year after completion of the trial to post the results. And we have the evidence that it works. For 10 emails sent, there is one additional trial with result posted. We have demonstrated that 5 years ago in a randomized control trials. We could encourage systematically PIs to give access to their protocol, to archive their data, and give them practical proposal for archiving their data or sharing their data. I propose also to switch from conventional meta-analysis to living meta-analysis, and from living meta-analysis to a global living network meta-analysis for one specific condition. In practice, from a series of disparate meta-analyses which are frequently out of date and redundant to a single systematic review and evidence synthesis of all available treatment, continuously updated for a specific condition or therapeutic indication. And if we do that, the additional burden for assessing the quality of trials and so on is very low, in fact. And we could move also from living network meta-analysis to living guidelines. Living network meta-analysis could help to optimize the guidelines development process and to update recommendations as soon as new relevant evidence becomes available. And we could provide timely, up-to-date, and high-quality guidance to target users. In conclusion, the overall production of evidence system needs dramatic changes from my perspective. Bringing together the different communities interested by a particular condition would be of mutual benefit for them. Setting up living communities to improve overall evidence production could be helpful for developing more relevant research, better quality research, and therefore more useful systematic reviews and guidelines. And developing such community effort may be a game changer to transform their field. Thank you.
Thank you for these very interesting ideas. So what questions do you have for Philippe?
Yes, thank you. Thank you very much, Philippe. I completely agree with you. My main question relates to the title of a paper that was written maybe 10 or 15 years ago and was called Medicine-Based Evidence, a Prerequisite for Evidence-Based Medicine. My problem when I read some meta-analysis or some guidelines is that there is a perfect analysis of the methodology, no doubt. But the pertinence of the question or the equipoise is not always looked at. And so there are some conclusions that rely mainly on studies that are highly critical on an ethical point of view.
No, I fully agree with that. I think that we could also challenge the relevance of question, and it's also a way to have better questions that are relevant for all the physicians and not only different people using different sources of data to make a decision. Patrick.
Thank you, Philippe. I fully support your idea for a highly needed, highly ambitious, and probably very difficult to achieve enterprise. Am I allowed to make it even more difficult? Because
Thanks.
I've grown convinced that we also need not just data from the trials and the meta-analysis, but also follow-up data from the actual cohorts managed with these respective interventions. Because what we frequently see is that the outcomes actually, once the intervention is introduced, especially for pharmaceuticals, but also for surgical interventions, actually are somewhat disappointed. For example, the complication rate may be quite different, and that's because the case mix over time also varies. So maybe we need a fourth component, and that's the observational data from real-life interventions. What's your thought on that?
No, I agree that at least for some disease or for some condition or for some type of intervention, for example, surgery, it's absolutely necessary to have access to high-quality observational data. And this group of people could also work on how to develop common cohorts or share some data about that. I agree with that.
Hi, I'm Carol Lenny from the University of British Columbia. I was wondering if there's any work that was done on looking at a cohort of conclusive, like network meta-analyses or meta-analyses, because that would be the first start, right? To see, to have like a set of, systematic reviews that were done that are conclusive, and then you can move on and make a priority list.
Yes, when you are performing a network analysis, we have a very nice view of the network of existing studies. Therefore, it's quite easy from that to identify what is the future research that is needed, for example. Therefore, my view is that network meta-analysis could be the center of this organization, and that it's an additional work. But when you are performing a network analysis, adding some data about the quality, data about transparency, and so on, is not a big challenge, my view.
And Paula, you're next.
Oh, Paula, yes.
Working. Oh no, it is. Ooh, sorry. Thanks, Philippe. I share the ambition. I think the potential to ask more relevant questions with more relevant outcomes for all of these areas, it is there. It could be achieved. Can you say a little bit about how you would bring together different sort of players in the research community from both non-commercial and commercial backgrounds?
My view is that it's mainly non-commercial or academic people who could join for such, at least for the pilot of such organization, I think, at the beginning at least. And in my view, it's not so far from what is doing Cochrane collaboration, except that I want to expand that not only to systematic review and meta-analysis, but also to assessing the quality of research and assessing the transparency and so on. But it could be communities, as for Cochrane, when there is a community of people working on the meta-analysis for, I don't know, rheumatoid arthritis or whatever.
Hi, Philippe. I love big ideas. I think it's fantastic. My question was similar to the previous one about how to make it happen. What are the next steps involving regulators, involving physicians, involving patients? Because it seems to me the more people that can be involved and buy into it, the more successful it's likely to be.
No, we tried to perform some pilot study of that. We have developed a pilot in the field of lung cancer. We are working on another pilot in the field of psoriasis. And the idea is to develop pilots and to be able to demonstrate that it could work. And after that, we could, perhaps people will be interested to do the same on another disease. In addition, there is a lot of very interesting actions that are performed for specific disease. For example, in the field of Alzheimer's disease, there is a very nice group working on methods in Alzheimer's disease. For some other disease, there is groups of people working on the quality of reporting in one disease, but we have to bring together all these initiatives in a larger initiative for one disease. Thank you.
Right, well, thank you very much. Let's thank all our speakers.